Now, life is anxiety. As I've said before, if you have no anxiety, you're dead. That's what life is. Life is confronting challenge and problems. And in this year in particular, as we go into the election, we have a series of anxieties, and the question is, which anxieties are the greatest? Because who wins the election will be the person who addresses the greatest anxiety. And the programs that will be formulated by the candidates that are significant will be determined by where that anxiety rests in the order of importance for the public. So certainly the first and overwhelming anxiety, which keeps George Bush Jr. ahead of Kerry, 47 to 43%. That's what the poll indicates. The anxiety that keeps George Bush Jr. up there is the anxiety about national security. And apparently, all the revelations about the trouble in Iraq, whatever it be, has not pushed him to second place. That is, he won in November of 2002 on the issue of national security. And people are saying, who is the best man for dealing with the issue of the war against terrorism? Well, right now, and that seems to be the primary issue, is 47 to 43 in favor of Bush. But that's not the only anxiety, otherwise there'd be no series. Polls have indicated that, obviously, the economy is of overwhelming concern to people, not in every sector, because in some sectors the economy has improved, but certainly for large numbers of people who are still struggling in this world of possible unemployment or unemployment, the economy is an important issue. And then there is the issue of what's happening to our country morally. And national security, the economy, and morality I have discussed. What is interesting is that number 2 on the list of one of the polls don't always agree. Do you ever notice that? They don't always agree. It depends on their sampling. But number 2 is an issue called education, which I found rather interesting. Polling people in America, there was great concern about what's happening in particular to the public schools in America. And close by it is an anxiety, a concern about health or health maintenance or health services. How do we stay healthy? And who's going to provide us with the ability to stay healthy in an age of high expectations? So I want to address both those anxieties. They're not number 1. Do you understand? If they were number 1, most likely the president wouldn't be at 47%. But they are there, and they are real, and they are issues in the election, and there are people who will vote to some degree on the basis of how each of the candidates responds to those issues. So, the education anxiety has to do with what's happening to public schools, and in most cases, it's what's happening to the public schools in inner cities, right? They're falling apart. There's no effective education in the inner cities of America, and there are huge populations in ineffective schools. The second anxiety is declining literacy. The fact that in this very, very advanced technological society, we're finding that large parts of the population can't effectively read or write, and many of them have graduated from high schools, and not only from high schools in the inner city. They graduated from high schools in suburbia. And people are saying, what kind of standards the amount of money spent on public education has been growing. Right now, we are spending on education $700 billion. And $700 billion. That is the expense. That's not trivial. So the question is, where is this money coming from? We all have a long list of what we need. Teachers, students, parents, everybody. Where is it coming from? Well, it used to come from something called local property taxes, do you remember? Well, there was a rebellion about 20 years ago. There was a rebellion in California, there's been a rebellion in Michigan, the whole thing. Property owners became sick and tired of bearing the full burden of education because their property taxes were rising. And what I find when I talk to many of my friends who regard themselves as liberals, on the one hand, they have a long list of what the schools need. But when I suggest that we raise the taxes, well, they're a burden. They are. The taxes are very high. And in an aging society, a large part of the population, in a singles society, a large part of the population do not have any children in the schools. I mean, it isn't a direct concern. It's a big problem. Who's going to pay for it? Well, if it's not going to be the local government, then maybe the state government. Well, over the last 40 years, the state government has assumed a big part of the responsibility for public education. And now state governments, as you may have noticed, are going bankrupt. So who's going to pay? Well, if it's not the state government, let it be the what? The federal government. There's even a suggestion by cynics who we're saying China's making so much money from us that we ought to make the Chinese government pay. For public education in this. I mean, who's going to pay for it? There are many things wrong. And money is not the only answer, but you certainly what? Need money. So it's not going to be local taxes, then the state taxes. Well, not state taxes, then federal funding. That'd be federal funding. And that's become a big issue over the last decade. Because the federal government has now moved into offering funding for public education. And then there's the issue about options. And this is very interesting. Public education obviously is a state service. And what we expect from state service varies. In terms of health, what we expect from state service is not that there's one hospital in the district and we all have to go to it. And we all have to use the doctor according to our age group. That's public schools, right? There's one school in the state service. There's one school in the district. We all have to go to the one. That school. And then by age they divide us. And if I'm 9 years old, I'm in grade 4, and I've got Miss Johnson. My grade 4 teacher. Do I like her? Don't I like her? Whatever. I don't have the option. Fixed system. What we would like is what we have in healthcare. We can choose our doctor and we can choose our hospital. That's also state services, certainly for over 65. And we're on Medicare. So if we can have it in one When I go for my health care, they don't say, well, you're 76, and then we have a certain set of doctors who only deal with people between 75 and 70. You're the same grade, you understand? And go see Dr. So-and-so. So there's a different concept that governs education from the state and health from the state. Now that's not true, that wasn't true in communist Russia. I mean, there was what? A hospital in the district, do you understand? You showed up at the hospital. You didn't like the hospital? It's called tough. And most likely there was a doctor assigned you. You don't like her, you don't like him? Tough. The state service, it's free. Not exactly free, since obviously the state derives its revenues from the services and the money of the population, even in communist regimes. And then, of course, there are the health anxieties, the overwhelming cost of it. Will Medicare go bankrupt? And there's also the issue of options. That is, people don't feel they have enough options. It's an option system right now. But if you end up in an HMO, it's not very much of a what? Of an option system. And there's the anxiety of aging. I mean, it's one of the anxieties that young people have in this country. There's this huge army of old people who are lasting longer than expected. And they have increasing demands to make on the health service. Who's going to pay for it? And all of that is aggravated by the cost of the technology that is needed now in order to provide you with the health service. One of the wonders of the new medical technology, health technology, are drugs. I mean, do you understand what's happened with medical technology? Cardiologists may soon be out of jobs. I don't know how many people take Lipitor in this. I have not surveyed. What is it? And there's a new thing that Pfizer has found. I mean, $1.5 billion for because the Lipitor patent is going to expire. All right? Now, it's a new thing. It's the Lysol of the arteries. Do you understand? It's for somebody who's crazy clean. Do you understand? It's going to clean out your arteries. So all this intrusive surgery, do you understand, with bypasses, I mean, the whole thing. I'm talking to a cardiologist who told me, a well-known one, the last heart attack he dealt with in his practice was in December. Do you understand what's going on? Now, in order to produce those things, I mean, there's a medical technology. In order to produce those things, I mean, there's costs attached to it, and some people would say there has to be a kind of motivational profit to produce the Lysol of the arteries. And then the other health concern is often viewed as a second issue. I mean, the environmental issue has two sides. The one side are the aesthetic side. The aesthetic side is, boy, just love those little seals. I just want to have a beautiful park here, and the whole thing, and I don't want buildings, but thank you, factories. But the most important part of the environmental movement is health. When I used to drive down to Eat Course in my childhood on the way to Wyandotte, I didn't think I was going to make it through. Did not think I was going to survive. I mean, do you remember this black pall that hung over the area, and it was obvious you were breathing it into your lungs, and all the people who died young from pollution? So the environmental issue is also tied to, it's part of the health issue. You can have what I call aesthetic environmentalism, but you can also have what is called health fundamentalism. Health environmentalism, which is fundamentalist environmentalism. So let me turn to education first, as an issue. When education began, there were no schools. There was no need for schools. Education, initially, and every one of us needs an education, starts with family. For most of human history, most people were educated by their family. That's how they learned to cook. That's how they learned to farm. That's how they learned to sew, right? Whatever they had to do, or to make a chair, or to fix a table, or put up a barn, whatever it be. And it was a little more complicated. There was always somebody in the neighborhood you could apprentice yourself to, who would train you. There were no books because nobody, almost nobody, read or wrote. And in fact, in my childhood, there were lots of people who had no formal education whatsoever, no school education. Were they educated? Yes. They were exposed to people who taught them skills. Right? Did they have a degree? Were they given a certificate? No. In fact, it's still a very important part of education around the world. But then things changed with the invention of writing. With the invention of writing, it became necessary to establish a thing called a school. Those people who were expert in reading and writing. That couldn't be your parents. Your parents couldn't what? Couldn't read or write. Nobody's parents could read or write. So now they have something called a school. The people who first took hold of schooling this profession were called the clergy. They were in charge of sacred writings, and they knew how to what? Read and write, so they were in charge. And so for most of human history, once writing appears, schools are in the hands of the clergy. If you want to learn about anything, if you want to learn things from books, and there aren't that many books around, if you want to learn things from books, you go generally to a church school or a religion school or whatever else. And a very small number of people could read and write. Even the richest and most powerful people often couldn't read or write. There was no need. If you wanted training in being a warrior, you didn't have to read a book called The Warrior Manual. Most people who wouldn't be very good warriors, all right? What made a very important change, and certainly affected America, was the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation elevated the Bible into the central place of religion. And in fact, it now became obligatory for everybody to have access to the Bible. So it was the Protestant Reformation that began to push something that would lead to a school system, a public school system, in order to teach kids how to read the Bible. In particular, the Calvinists in Western Europe, the Huguenots and Presbyterians in Scotland, and the Reformed people in Holland, and their counterparts in England pushed this. And out of it came something that we call the common school. The purpose of the school was you went there to what? Learn how to read. And what was the text? How to read the Bible. In fact, the first people to come to this country as English colonists, the Puritans and Pilgrims, that's what they established. So now we have the beginning of what we call a kind of public, do you understand? It's a community school. No, it's actually it's a community school. Paid for by the community, all of whom belong to the same religion, or better, belong to the same religion. And there is this curriculum for teaching people, kids, how to read and write. Beginning of what we would call a community school system. that transformed this little community school was the arrival in the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century of this transforming experience that we call the Age of Science, which took people out of small villages, put them into cities, and one of the requirements for living in an urban industrial society, it's a requirement, because their science is to know how to read and write. So now it wasn't simply a religious requirement. It was now a state requirement. And in the 18th and 19th century, there emerged in particular in Western Europe what we call the great nations, who were reinforced no longer not so much by religion, but were reinforced by something that we call nationalism or patriotism. If you're a good citizen, do you understand? You know your language, don't you? You have to know how to read and write. If you're a good citizen, you know what it means to be a patriot. You know the history of your country. If you're a good citizen, you not only know how to read and write, you're able to what? Do arithmetic, because you have to be useful. In order to be useful in an urban industrial society, you basically have to have some kind of mathematical information. So out of it came a very powerful idea. And that idea was that education was the responsibility of the state, because it's the responsibility of the state to guarantee that all citizens turn into useful patriots. Now, the country that was wedded to this idea most intensely appeared at the end of the 19th century. It was initially called Prussia, and then after 1871, it was called Germany. And actually, it was Germany under Bismarck that established what we would call the model for the state school system. Now, education, that is literacy education, is no longer a luxury. It is now regarded by the state as a necessity. And the state will provide it to you for free on lower levels. Not on higher levels, do you understand? But on lower levels. Because everybody needs it. We're not going to have a nation unless everybody can read and write and do arithmetic and be patriotic and know the history, whatever. You got to come bring them all together. So out of it came the model. In time, the Bismarck model spread all over the world. It reached England and it reached North America. North America already had the Protestant common school. And it was easy to take the Protestant common school and turn it into a public school. Obviously, there were problems in doing it because the schools had been Protestant. Can you take the Protestantism out of the school and just turn it into a kind of universal patriotic American school? So when the American public school began, it confronted certain issues that never go away, but they're important issues. The first was, how long do you go to school? In fact, my school term was determined by farmers. We had to go to school when the weather was terrible, in January and February, and in July and August, when what? It would have been easy to go to school. We didn't go to school. Why didn't we go to school? Because farmers, when they first devised the schedule for school, in July and August, you have to help what? On the farm. Farm kids couldn't do that. So you got on for the summer. But how long? 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, whatever. Still an issue. I always thought my vacation was too long. I thought it was wasted. I had enough of the streets. I went to the Fisher Building, I went downtown, the whole thing, the cottage, the whole thing. Fun. By the beginning of August, I was ready to go back to school, but they told me I couldn't go back to school until September. I was peculiar about it, but I do want to tell you. I do want to tell you that because it wasn't an irrational question. My time was being wasted. One of the other questions is how inclusive. That is, do you include just Protestants? Do you include Protestants and Catholics? Do you include Protestants, Catholics, and Jews? Do you include Protestants, Catholics, and Jews? Do you include African American? How broad? Because what the school does is a function of how inclusive it is, and that remains a big issue. The French can't even figure out how to include Muslims, can they? Without telling them to take off their headscarf. One of the big issues was the curriculum. The curriculum, when it started out as a common school, was the Bible. Well, maybe that isn't appropriate in an inclusive school. So then what do you teach? Arithmetic, history, there's social studies, and so you want nature study, and you want some science. The whole curriculum is now changing. It's the urban industrial age. They were trying to struggle as to what you put into it because what was in there was so different. And then what we call the indoctrination. We always started off the school day with, I pledge allegiance to the flag. Look a little bit like the United States, where we sang, "My country, 'tis of thee." We have a whole patriotic element, do you understand? And we had stories about American history and how wonderful it was to be American. That was the purpose of the school. It wasn't to turn me into a Canadian. It was to turn me into, turn me into an American. How much? And then the culture of the school. That's the headscarf issue. Is the culture supposed to be Protestant? The culture of my public school was Protestant. Almost all the spinster teachers I had were Protestant spinsters. They were there, and they conveyed a certain kind of culture. It's the foundation culture of the United States of America. If some teacher walked in with a headscarf, do you understand? In grade 1, I would have been totally I wouldn't know what to do. I couldn't even adjust to it. So the curriculum that emerged consisted of basics, that's what? Reading, writing, arithmetic. Got it. Right. It included patriotism. It included science, both natural, physical, and social. It included health education. Remember that phrase? Sometimes it was gym, but there were also little lectures about what you eat and how you take care of your personal hygiene and the whole thing. And there was arts. We had a little bit of music and glee. They threw them in. How much art? That was always a big question. How much art? And arts and crafts and the whole thing. And then we always had a little values education, because on our report card they marked us not only on achievement but also on effort. Remember the effort? Reliability, collaboration, the whole thing. And so the teacher had to talk a little bit about these values, because how can they grade you on these things if they're not going to talk about them? So they pasted this thing together. And in order to be inclusive, they basically threw out the religious indoctrination, right? And they substituted a kind of neutral, religion-independent values education, which was part of the school curriculum, and that became the foundation of the school, and it turned out to be a success. If you graduated from the 8th grade in 1900 from a public school, you could get a pretty good job. You could read and write, right? You might even become a bookkeeper. If you graduated from a high school, already by 1940, you most likely could get one. Pretty good. You could get a pretty good job. And foundation of success in our culture. It received support from property owners. Certainly in my childhood, the overwhelming majority of people in my neighborhood were not older, retired people. They were people with children. There were lots of children running around, and so there was a willingness to support it through public taxation. It was a success because the profession of teacher was so prestigious. You may not have been paid a lot, but if you told somebody you were a teacher, people looked up to you. And if you taught in a high school, it's like being a professor in a college. I mean, that was a very prestigious role. People wanted to be teachers not only because of the money, there wasn't that much money. They wanted to be teachers because it was prestigious. There was a lot of respect attached to it. Now, the way the system worked, obviously, which made it a success, was that for those people who felt the public school system didn't provide all the education they wanted, there was an option. It was generally called the parochial school system, which was privately funded. And all of that was reinforced by prosperity, so people could pay their taxes. There was the Depression, but then they came out of the Depression. There were families that functioned, so the children had to report not only to their teacher or their principal, they had to report to their parents, who reinforced the discipline of the school. It was reinforced by the fact that it was the primary way of taking immigrants from all kinds of ethnicities, tossing them into this melting pot, which was the public school, and producing what we call an American, and hopefully an American patriot. It was very successful because you could graduate from a public school, and there were millions of jobs for unskilled labor. So if you could just read and write, read the signs, got it? And read a few instructions, whatever. There was all this unskilled, not complex scientific training, complex technology. You could just go and you could get a job. And therefore it worked because it led to expectations that were fulfillable. And the expectations were low. People did not expect that their education would guarantee their happiness or provide the ultimate meaning to their life or give them interesting work. The expectation level coming out of what I would call the immigrant generation was low. And then there was the youth. Prior to the 1960s, the students who went to the public schools, on the whole, still had enormous respect for age and for the authority of teachers. Were there discipline problems in the school? I had a lot of kids in my class that acted up. The disruptions, I assure you, are actually minor compared to the experiences that now go on in the public. Yeah, the mischievous kid, yes. But it was all reinforced by that. And then came the challenge. So now let me talk about the challenge. The challenge that came to public education. And we're only talking about primary and secondary education here. I'm not addressing tertiary, which is the university sector, which is now for over half the population part of their education. Was the arrival because of prosperity, with the idea of individualism. What made the public school system work was that it was organized to a large degree have unique needs, and I need my unique needs dealt with, that I've got parents who know that I'm unique, maybe a genius, and indeed have unique needs that need to be the whole thing. So out of that came, at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, came John Dewey. And progressive education meant no child is simply to be dealt with as a thing to be turned into an American baby. Every child is a unique individual and must be dealt with as a unique individual. So, child 1 may be going at this pace. Child 2 is going at this pace. Child 1 wants to do science first and then do mathematics. And child 2 wants to do mathematics first and wants to do, no. So now you're into a whole new system. Certainly triggered by what we call the increasing expectation of the middle class. So now when you look at the public school, it's not enough that your kid gets through the uniform curriculum. You want a school that deals with the unique character of my child. Do you understand the burden you have now placed? No, that's not right. Do you understand the burden that you have now placed on the public school? I'm not saying that it's not justified. I'm just saying go ahead the burden. Or on the teacher. My teacher just got out there and said to the class, here it is. This is the information you master. I don't care whether you get sick listening to it, don't get sick listening. Whatever it is, this is it. Not now. Sean. I watch what goes on in the schools now. It's time consuming. You can't have 45 kids and do that. Got to listen to everyone. And then you have to listen to his parents. And maybe grandparents. It's a revolution. One of the things, obviously, that happened was that families began to be less available to be supported. In the middle class, there was increasing divorce. And in the lower class, there was the increasing phenomenon of families that simply fell apart, and where a single mother, do you understand, was trying to take care of all these unique children, and you couldn't call up the parent who may have been maybe working, both the mother and the father. You don't have a parental support system. And that's a huge loss on the part of the school system. And then you have the size. Certainly as public school systems were developed, the idea was ultimately, in order to save money and also to have prestige, to create these giant institutions. The high school I went to was actually small. There were only 3,000 to 3,500 students in Detroit. But there were high schools in New York that had 5,000 to 6,000 students, bigger than maybe half the universities in the country. I went to DeWitt Clinton somewhere up in the Bronx. I mean, it was like a college campus. Well, now, if you're going to have institutions that big, you need what? Big administrations. And now there emerges something that is problematic, which is many teachers turn into administrators, and now there comes this tension. We have it in health between doctors and the accountants. Now, it's the tension between the teachers and the administration. In Detroit, it's the tension between the teachers who teach in the schools and the people who are in the Maccabees building. It used to be called the Maccabees building. A long time ago. That's it. And that's the problem of bureaucracy, so there it is. And then there was the challenge of the fact that increasing numbers of immigrants by the second or third generation were no longer comfortable being excluded. What do you mean? I send my child to the parochial school. I'm an American citizen who pays taxes. Why can't you give me money to choose the school school I want. Just as you may give me money to choose the doctor I want. And all of it was aggravated by racism. The coming, especially into northern cities, of huge numbers of African Americans from the South, and that produced the racial tensions, which would result in the flight of white people into suburbia, leaving the inner cities of many of the great cities of the United States of America, African American ghettos without the financial resources to solve their problems. Then there was the youth revolution in the 60s that came together with black liberation, which didn't solve the problem of black segregation. And that's when the young people opened their minds. It's what's called a delayed reaction. In a modern urban society, it's no longer true that parents may indeed have more information than children. Certainly on technical matters, technological matters. And so the reverence for the past goes. And it's expressed in the fact that children open their mouths. And what it produced, and still is producing, because teachers haven't adjusted. One of the nice things about being a teacher was, I used to watch my teachers. You'd walk into the room and your intimidation power was no, it's gratifying. It's overwhelming. All these kids suddenly want. You remember that? Just sit up! To be a teacher today, what you do is you often be rational. You say, oh, I want to be their friend. I don't mind that their feet are sticking in front of my face. Isn't it wonderful? We have this new egalitarian age. I mean, the issues of discipline are enormous. Absolutely enormous. Because the reverence for authority has virtually passed from our society, and in egalitarian age, we encourage everybody to be his own authority. You are you, you are your person, do you understand? Your opinion is worth as much as everything. Thank you very much. But a student's opinion shouldn't be worth as much as a teacher's opinion, otherwise he doesn't need a teacher. That's why I used to listen to my teachers. They had information that I could use, needed. If I think that I know it all, my opinion is just as important, then why do I need a teacher? I can ask a question, make a challenge, but I'm there to learn. And of course, it was aggravated by the happiness motif of the modern leisure consumer culture. So now you ask your child when he comes home from school, did you enjoy school? Nobody ever asked me. I did enjoy school. I was peculiar. But I mean, I did enjoy school. I did enjoy it. But nobody asked me that. Whether I enjoyed it, didn't enjoy it, there's work. School is work. It's part of training to become a useful citizen. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're not happy. Mrs. Stevens, my child is very unhappy. Well, I know, Mrs. Jones, because I asked him to do some homework, and homework is tedious. No, homework is tedious. Do you understand? I mean, sometimes it's tedious. Mastering all those words, do you understand, in French is tedious. But now the teacher, you understand the position of the teacher, because I sometimes look at these burned out teachers. Do you understand? They burned out teachers. I mean, they're dealing with a parental system that's gone in many cases. They're dealing with all these children that have individual needs, sometimes in overcrowded environments, and then they're dealing with students who want to be entertained. You know how hard it is to teach them? When you walk into a class, I know I walk into high school classes sometimes this week. You have to be on. This is drama school. You have to be on. turned to unions. And then the unions created a problem. The problem is something called tenure. Most people don't have tenure in most places. If they work for the government, they have tenure. Which means that your job is guaranteed. So the school is filled. That was supposed to protect them against what? People who would dismiss them irrationally and unjustifiably. But now the system is filled with all these people who are burned out, you understand? Who stay in the system because where are they going to go? They've had it, and who may not be, in some cases, very good teachers. Try to remove them. Impossible. It happens in corporations too. Because corporations can also do their own tenure. So the consequence of this is what we're dealing with in 2004. It's the issue that needs to be addressed. The first is the dichotomy between suburban public schools and inner city public schools. Suburban public schools have a lot of problems, but on the whole they work and they produce students who can get into what? Universities and can move on into what we call information age, technology, jobs. Not as perfectly as they ought to, maybe, but they're functioning. Not true of the inner city. So that means that maybe what works in suburbia doesn't work in the inner city, and you can't have a standard formula. The second consequence is declining confidence on the part of the public in the public schools. In suburbia, most likely, is not justified. But the expectation level now of middle-class families with regard to what schools ought to do for their children is so high that given the funding that exists for the school system, they can't possibly meet those expectations. For immigrant parents, this institution was what? Wow! For sophisticated people who go to France, who go to Germany, whatever else. And they have this special child. So there is declining confidence in the system. There is overcrowding because the funding cannot sustain, even in suburbia, the size class you need for individualized education, right? For the kind of education I received, you could have 45. And when I went to university, I sat in classes, the lecture halls, there were 300 people there. Was I annoyed? No, I got good information. But if you're trying to deal with individuals, then you got to shrink it so the teacher has time to spend with individuals. So now you've got overcrowding. And then you've got teacher morale. You've got all these burned out teachers who no longer receive respect, are now viewed as union people, who are now dealing with very demanding parents or absent parents. They burn out. My first grade teacher, when I got her, had already taught for 35 years, and she was not burned out. But Miss Williams walked into the class. Do you understand? And all those little kids just sat up straight. Do you understand? She was in church. She was not burned out. But now you go, they're burned out. And in many cases, they have no alternative but to continue teaching because that's the way they get up. They make a living. I mean, what are they supposed to do? Then there's a discipline problem. I sometimes go into school classrooms to see how teachers deal with it. There's some wonderful teachers, though. They're so creative. And despite the frustration, they work so hard to make things work. And then there are others who have what I call an array of videos. Whenever there's a continue, and not simply in the inner city. Discipline problems are also problems in suburbia. And you have to be a master of psychology, do you understand? In order to control classes, especially if you want to do what I call individual work. One of the consequences, obviously, is increasing private options as people become more frustrated with the public schools, either through the height of their expectations or because of the deplorable condition of the schools, especially in the inner city. They turn to private options. So now we have large numbers of people, including many poor people, who struggle. They're in the inner city of Detroit. They're not Catholic. They're sending their kid to a Catholic parochial school because at least there's some level of law and order. And they would like a little relief from somebody who cares other than some kind of doctrinaire separation of church and state, Nick. We give them a few bucks to pay for the tuition. They're not rich people sending their kids to Cranbrook. And in fact, most liberals don't give them any notice because what they're asking for is what? Principle. No money for a religious institution. I don't care that you're poor and that your options are what? Limited. I don't care. And one of the consequences with this incoming inclusive, the public school is supposed to include everybody. If your behavior problem, is the public school supposed to keep you? Private school doesn't have to keep you. The public school has to keep you. Do you have a major disability? Private school doesn't have to take you. Public school has to what? Okay, so it has to be inclusive. And no matter what group you come from, you are to be included. Well, at one time, what happened was Anglo-Saxons had to include Germans. And then they had to include Italians. Then they had to include Ashkenazic Jews. Okay. But now they have to include people from the Middle East. So now you're in Fordson High School in Dearborn. So you're left over from the old era when Dearborn was what? Sort of WASP. And now the boys behave so differently, and the smell of the food is different. Do you understand? When the girls come in with headscarves, and what? How do I integrate? How do I deal with it? How do I respond? The cultural gulfs, do you understand, now in the school system are so great. So I get Hmong people from northern Laos, hill people. Well, I know how to deal with the Romanian, but how do I deal with the Hmong? It's mind-boggling. And what's happened in the public school system, I mean, it's mind-boggling somewhere, the changes that have occurred. So what's been the response? The response is that since 1993, coming of the Clinton administration, responding to the funding issue, I mean, to take care of all of this, the idea now arose, first among the Democrats, that there need to be two things. One, federal funding. Oh, that's moving up from what? Local funding, state funding, now we're what? Federal government should give money directly to the schools. The local schools should be getting federal money. It's a big change. And the second is called standards. schools, people are complaining they can't read, they can't write. So in 1994, I don't know if you remember, there was the Elementary and Secondary School Act. Don't remember it, I'll tell you. In 1994, there was the Elementary and Secondary School Act that was passed during the Clinton administration. And the idea of the act was, one, to begin the process of providing federal funding for schools. And the second was to establish standards to test the performance of students and teachers. Teachers were not only assaulted with all these other things, now they were going to be assaulted with what? Are they competent? They've been teaching now for 36 years. Are they competent? Can they teach? I mean, if you're in a big corporation, you're being paid $150,000 a year, $200,000, then fine. Now, but it's standards, right? Money, standards from the federal government. So now that becomes an expectation. Now the federal government enters into what we call local public school education, which at one time had been only a local affair, right? Local school boards. And then when the local school board, the local funding didn't work, you brought in the state. And increasingly the state began to provide more and more money, and then the states are going bankrupt. So now you bring in the federal government. Now that idea was an idea picked up by the Republicans for a very simple reason. Their children are also going, in almost all cases, to the public schools. And they don't want to pay any more local property taxes. And they can see that their states are bankrupt. And in fact, the Republicans realize that although they denounce the welfare state, the state has to provide welfare, whether it's health welfare or education welfare. People are accustomed to it. People in America are accustomed to free education. What can I do? So George Bush Jr., in his campaign in the year 2000, because Gore and Bush discussed it, right? Talked about the fact that we, not just the Democrats, it's the what? It's the Republicans. We are interested in education. And out of it would come a bill that was passed with overwhelming Republican support. Otherwise, it wouldn't have gotten through the House of Representatives. The whole process began before September the 11th, but the bill was not finally approved until January 2002. So no child left behind. Now, the No Child Left Behind says that the federal government will make sure that every child in this country receives an adequate education. No child left behind. And the implication was very clear, was that the federal government, having said that, in the bill, would then provide the money to do it. Now, the premise behind it is very clear. The premise behind it is that one of the most important things we need in order to make this thing work is money. One of the issues that always came up was class size. In order to shrink class size, you need what? More teachers. In order to pay for more teachers, you have to what? Have more money, so the funding. And that funding would be available not only to prosperous suburbia, that funding would be especially available to the inner cities. That sounded like a terrific initiative. Even Ted Kennedy had to say, unless there's supervision. Too much money is what? Wasted. So what we are going to do is establish standards all over this country. Now, this was an interesting Republican initiative, because the one thing that Republicans always favored was local autonomy. They were always favoring local boards of education controlling the thing, and the federal government for sure should keep its nose out of it. No longer. Interesting change. When people say one party is for government interference and the other party isn't. Not true. The government will now establish, as they do in other countries, in particular in France. If you're in France, no matter where you are in France, there is a test. You could be in Paris, you could be in Lille, you could be in Marseille, you could be in Bordeaux, you could be in Lyon. It doesn't make any difference if you're in that, you understand, in that grade, in that class. There is a test. And if you don't pass it, you flunk it. And the purpose of the teacher is to enable you to pass the test, because the passing of the test is an indication, at least according to the theory, that you have mastered the information that you need. So now, testing. And in fact, there are national tests. If you want our money, you don't have to take our money. If you want our money, you're going to have to take the tests, which now means that the purpose of the teacher is to train the student to pass the tests. Now, when you have a standard test, that goes against the grain of one of the principles that emerged after World War II. One of the principles that emerged after World War II is every student in my class is an individual. Therefore, a test that works for one student may not work for the other. Every student needs a what? A test that is appropriate to his own or her own individuality. No. One test. You either read or you can't read it. We'll find out whether you can if you take the one. Not a big thing. You can either multiply or you can't multiply, and we're going to find out whether you can multiply. You take the test. And not only that, if a school falls below a certain percentage of passers of the test, that school will be publicly condemned as a failing school. Now you're on a failing attitude. Your school is now on this list called failing. No, it's the failing school. And you will not be eligible to receive any more funds, and the children in your school will also be eligible to move from your school to another school, because why would any parent want their child in a failing school? Got this? The first part sounds nice, money. The second part, the supervision, sounds more problematic, but then after all, many people said, well, what we need are standards. And the third response has been the evolution, certainly over the last decade, of something that's become very popular in the state of Michigan. It's called the public charter school. It's a school funded by the state or by the local board of education that is not under the direct supervision of the administration of a local public school. We had a speaker who came to us at the beginning of March. His name is Doug Ross, a former candidate for governor in the state of Michigan, who has created this whole campus of schools, especially a high school, for preparing students in the inner city to get into university. are burdened by inefficient large administrations, oppressive administrations, here will be a chance for them to go out and be creative, and for the students to receive public funding for this. Teacher morale will be improved, the students will benefit, and the charter school system is certainly caught fire. Not popular with the official teachers' unions, who regard them as competitive even though they are public schools, because the charter schools do not have to hire union members in all cases. So, one of the responses, which they tried, one of them was decentralizing the system. They tried that in New York City. It was a disaster. They tried it to some degree in Detroit. The other thing that seems to be working is specialization. Create a school for the performing arts. Create a school for science. Create a school for gifted children, the whole thing. They started that in the Detroit school system, and they've done it in other school systems, which means you don't go simply to the school in your district. There's a school that appeals to your interests, that has the right student body, and you can go there. One of the responses is a response for people who are into the separation of religion and government. They have to hold their seats. Called the voucher proposal. The voucher proposal is no different from our houses. It simply says, we will help you get educated. We will give money to your parents. And then your parents can choose not the doctor they want, they can choose the what? The school they want. Oh. Very controversial, right? Because they may choose a school that has some form of religious indoctrination, and that certainly would violate, according to the interpretation, the requirements of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. By this movement, it's not a majority, but it's what? It's a fairly powerful movement, and its supporters come not simply from the rich, who don't really need the state to pay the tuitions of their children in private schools. It wouldn't hurt. It also comes from the poor, like that story of the mother in Detroit who sends the kid to a Catholic parochial school and can't pay for it. She wants an education for her child. In fact, the idea became so popular that both Cleveland and Milwaukee allowed that. And in fact, the Supreme Court supported the Cleveland initiative. You got the condition and the response? There's a basic problem with the no child left behind. It's not a major. I mean, there are two problems. One is the way the standards are being applied, where schools that have been known to be rather effective schools or producing schools end up on the failing list because they don't get enough of their students, especially if they're in the inner city, to take the test, and so they fall below the percentage. The main problem is the following. Big issue. They passed the bill for the federal government to give money, but there ain't no money. Got it? So it's like a pious resolution, like a New Year's resolution. Yep. Pass the bill, and so the government can say, we support more funding for the children of this country. There's no money for a very simple reason. There's an enormous tax cut. The revenues have been reduced, and there is an there's a war. There is no money, and the deficit of this country, the total national debt, is now $7 trillion. I mentioned that when I talked about the economy. So the issue, let me just say, if you had what a candidate should have, if education were sort of at the top, okay, what you have is a vision for how to fund this thing. You would have a vision for a dual plan, one for the suburbs and one for the inner city. Right? We wouldn't be caught up in what we call liberal cliches. Right? You would have a plan for how to raise teacher morale so that the way you handle the standards thing is such that you don't undermine the morale of the teachers. He would have a plan to balance things. So yes, you would have the tests, but there would be also other criteria that you would use to determine the performance level of the school. It would be a vision which also would take care of options to the public schools and provide some kind of relief to people who are poor, who are in situations where they cannot even use them. And it would also address another issue. So I'll tell you where a lot of the money is going, which is not available to the schools. I hesitate to do this, but I can do it because I'm in that category. The cost of maintaining the aging in our society is overwhelming and will only increase. And in fact, that cost lies in competition with taking care of the young. And so what you say, if you're an idealist, well, there should be money for both. There isn't. And in fact, that becomes one of the issues in our country. I mean, there is a tension, wasn't there? There are two segments of the population that are in competition. But nobody, neither Kerry nor Bush, have articulated what I would call a complete vision, and I'll tell you why. Because the primary issue in this campaign is national security. And because it's the primary issue, the public is concerned about education. But that may not be the determining issue. I mean, I read lots of things in the newspaper and reports, statements made by Kerry and statements made by Bush. Basically, it comes back to no child left behind, and we need the money. And we'll get the money. Thank you. So now that leads me to the competitive issue. The competitive issue to education. And I haven't even touched on tertiary education. Tertiary education is the funding of university education. Quite frankly, if you give a person now a high school certificate, he can do what? Nothing. First of all, he has to go through grades 13 through 16, that's called undergraduate school. He has to find himself. And then he has to go on to some kind of a major that's going to provide him with what? Employment in the information technology age. And that's the future of the United States of America, because how else are we going to compete with the world